You hear this word oligarchy thrown around all the time, right? On the news, in articles. It sounds super important, but what does it actually mean? Well, let's break it down.
Okay, so what could ancient Sparta, post-Soviet Russia, and the Hunger Games possibly have in common? I know, it sounds like the setup for a really weird joke, but stick with me because by the end of this, you're going to see exactly how they're all tied together by this one big idea.
All right, first things first. To really get what an oligarchy is all about, we've got to go back to basics, back to where the word even comes from.
The word itself is a direct import from ancient Greek. You've got oligos, which means few, and archo, which means to rule. Put them together, and what do you get? Ruled by the few. Simple, right? But who exactly are the few? That's where it gets interesting.
Well, the famous philosopher Aristotle, he had a pretty blunt take on it. No beating around the bush. For him, it was just the rule of the rich. That's it. The key ingredient, the thing that set the rulers apart, was money. Pure and simple. Okay, so it's super important to get this straight, because there are a few similar ideas floating around. An oligarchy isn't a tyranny. That's ruled by just one person. And it's kind of like an aristocracy, ruled by the noble or upper class. But the key difference? Oligarchy is really, really tied to wealth and power, not just having a fancy last name or some ancient family tree. And believe me, this isn't some newfangled idea. Not at all. In fact, it was one of the most popular ways to run a country way back in the ancient world.
Think about it. Long before Athens got famous for its democracy, for rule by the many, oligarchy was basically the standard operating procedure for most Greek city-states. And while Athens was doing its thing, its biggest rival, Sparta, was over there perfecting the complete opposite, rule by the few.
So, what did that actually look like in Sparta? Well, yeah, they had two kings, but that was kind of for show. The real power, the ones pulling all the strings, that was a tiny group, a council of 28 elders, and these 5 officials called ephors. This small crew made all the big calls, from going to war to keeping their whole rigid society in line. And their number one goal? Staying on top, militarily speaking, which meant controlling this huge population of enslaved people called the helots. For them, having all the power in the hands of a few wasn't just a good idea, it was absolutely essential to their way of life.
Okay, now let's hit the fast-forward button. We're jumping ahead, about 2,500 years. The word oligarch basically went quiet for a long time, but then, bam, it made a huge comeback in the 1990s. And the reason? Russia.
So picture this. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991. The new Russian government has all these massive state-owned industries. We're talking oil, gas, the works. They decide to privatize everything. They came up with this voucher program that was supposed to make everyone a part owner. Sounds good, right? Well, in reality, a handful of guys with the right connections swooped in and bought up the crown jewels of the entire country for like pennies on the dollar.
The author David Satter really nailed the feeling of that time. He basically described it as a total free-for-all. There were no real laws in place, which created this Wild West situation, a gold rush for anyone ruthless enough to grab for money and power. And these guys got rich, insanely rich, almost overnight.
And the result? It's just staggering. Get this. A report from Credit Suisse found that by 2013, just 110 people, 110, owned 35% of all the household wealth in Russia. Think about that. That is an unbelievable concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny, tiny handful of people. So here's the kicker, the part where this all gets locked in. When Vladimir Putin came to power, he basically made a deal with these new oligarchs. The arrangement was simple. You can keep your yachts, your billions, your influence, on one condition. You stay out of my way politically, and you support my government. It was this grand bargain that really cemented their status and their power.
And that brings us right up to the present day, and to a pretty heated debate. Because this word, oligarchy, which for a long time we only talked about in history class or when we talked about other countries, is now being used to talk about the United States.
You've got figures like Senator Bernie Sanders, for instance. He's been making this argument for a while, even back in 2010. His point was that the U.S. was heading towards a system where, in his words, a small number of families control the economic and political life of our country.
And the people who agree with him, they often point to stats like this one, which is just wow. The 400 richest Americans have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the country combined. Let that sink in.
That's 400 people versus more than 150 million people. And it's not just politicians. You have major economists like Thomas Piketty saying the same thing. In his massive, game-changing book, he basically sent up a warning flare, saying that this skyrocketing inequality poses a real risk of the U.S. drifting towards oligarchy. Then there was this huge study back in 2014 from political scientists at Princeton and Northwestern. It really poured some fuel on the fire. They looked at almost 2,000 different U.S. policies, and their conclusion was pretty shocking. They found that what the average American wanted had basically zero, as in a statistically insignificant impact on what laws actually got passed. What did matter? The preferences of economic elites and powerful interest groups. Now, they were careful to add a really important detail. This doesn't make the U.S. a pure oligarchy, because we still have all the key democratic stuff, like elections and free speech.
Okay, so let's tie this all together. What's the big takeaway here? Remember that question from the beginning? Sparta, Russia, the Hunger Games? Now you see the connection, right? The common thread is always the same. It doesn't matter if it's a warrior class in Sparta, a bunch of businessmen in Russia, or the capital in Panem. An oligarchy is born when a small group uses whatever advantage they have, whether it's family name, incredible wealth, or political connections, to grab power and control everyone else.
And that leaves us with one last really big question to think about. If history teaches us anything, it's that power seems to love concentrating in the hands of just a few people. So, how do we protect rule by the many? How does a society make sure that power stays with the people? It's a question they were wrestling with in ancient Sparta, and it's just as urgent today.